Hey guys, I'm Joseph. I go by Audi Snapper on the forums, and today is part 2 of maybe a 3 or 4 part series. I'm not quite sure. We'll see how deep I get into this.
Funny how the story goes, little hope but bigger dreams. They try to bring a sucker down, singing louder than the crowd. Listen the rhythm, I'm feeling brand new. Keep pushing forward, it's gonna save you. Never look down, love, not when we shine so bright.
If you haven't seen it already, check out part 1, which the reason I'm pointing over here is because I'm going to link it over here. Check out part 1 of the series. It was kind of the post teardown of the trophy truck. I wanted to add some additional pieces to the cage that I kind of skimped on during the original build. Plus I wanted to modify that front bumper to kind of be more of a modern trophy truck bumper. So again, check out part 1. I cover how I'm cutting the rods and the tubes, and how I'm prepping them, how I'm putting a fish mouth at the end of the rods to make sure that they fit into the cage real snug before they're actually welded or brazed. And then part 2 today is going to be about the actual brazing process. I'm going to cover the materials that you need. I'm going to cover the tools that you'll need, some of the tools that I use, and as well as some of the helpful tips and tricks that I learned during my cage build. After that, eventually we'll get into part 3. We'll talk about media blasting. We'll talk about prepping the cage for paint, getting it all ready to go. And then maybe part 4 will be a reassembly, hopefully. So, fingers crossed. Let's jump over to the workbench. We'll talk about that process. Again, I'll show you everything that you need, and we'll do a little example of brazing to show you guys how easy it is, and maybe it'll be helpful for you in your next build. As always, if you guys have any questions, feel free to leave the questions in the comments below, and I'm usually pretty good about getting back to you guys within a day or so, sometimes pretty quickly. So let's jump right over to the workbench and we'll get to it. Alright guys, so we're over here in the workshop. I've got 3 cameras. We've got camera 1, or camera A I guess they call it in the business, camera B, which focuses here, and then we got the overhead camera here, which is camera C, I guess. I don't know. I don't even know how it focuses. Anyway, so I've got you guys covered when it comes to the different angles of shooting this. We got some close-up stuff, and then you get to see me talking again. So you're going to need some stuff. You're going to need some tools. You're going to need some supplies, materials, all of which you can get online. Obviously, if you're watching YouTube, you're probably very savvy when it comes to shopping online. From the overhead cam, you can kind of see what's going on. Same with this side camera. We've got lots of materials floating around here, and miscellaneous pieces of metal, brushes, pliers, things like that. They're all kind of helpful, not critical, but helpful when doing the brazing of these cages. So let's jump in with the major tools or items that you'll need to kind of make this happen. I'm not going to go into detail when it comes to the torch setup. The torch setup you can get at Home Depot. You can also get it online at McMaster Car, so forth and so on. You're going to need 2 things. You're going to need a tank of oxygen, and you're going to need a tank of fuel. Now that fuel can be propane, it can be acetylene. You're going to have 1 hose that's the oxygen, 1 hose that's the fuel. In my case, it's the acetylene. See if I can show you guys this in the other camera. Camera above. There we go. That's probably a better shot. And for me, I'm using a looks like a 0 tip. I'm not sure if that's they call it an aught tip or a 0 tip. That seems to work well for me. But let's look at the other items that we need. You're going to need a striker. They say that using matches or lighters is not a good idea. I'm not sure why that is, but I've always had a striker. I use a striker. I kind of just follow the rules when it comes to that. One of the other elements that you're going to need when it comes to materials is you're going to need a flux. This happens to be a silver brazing flux. I can't tell you if that's the right flux for every project. I know it probably works with most iron metals, cast iron, steel, stainless steel, so forth. Show you guys what that looks like up close, and maybe you can search for it online. The other item that you're going to need is you're going to need a brazing rod. Brazing rods come coated with flux, so you could skip this step, or you can get them like this, which is just a bare wire. It's a bronze wire. It's fairly soft. It's got a low melting point, and it works really well with the mild steels that we're using for these cages. Like I mentioned earlier, I think I got this on McMaster Car, but you know, I've got 50 rods here, and I built an entire cage probably with 3 rods. I don't know that you can buy less. Maybe you can get shorter rods. These are what, 3 feet long, 2 feet long, 2.5, 3 feet long. I happen to choose the 16 gauge. Or I don't know if they call it gauge, but 16 diameter wire. That worked really well, again, for this kind of small approach or small format. I think if you were doing larger welds, maybe, you know, a little bit thicker diameter wire would work well. So those are the 4 major components. You need a torch, you need a flux, you need wires, and you need a striker. Those are kind of the core elements for the brazing process. Now everything else you see on the table, minus the cage, are sort of the accessory items that you'll need or that are helpful when it comes to doing the brazing during the brazing process. You do not need a welding helmet. I happen to have a welding helmet. Brazing is not so bright that you need a welding helmet. You only need braze or torch goggles. You can buy them. They look like sunglasses for the most part. They're just really dark. You can still see through them. Unlike a welding helmet, when you flip it down, you can't see through it unless you're actually welding. So in this particular case, I had a welding helmet previously. I put a tape over the sensor. This is a self-dimming glass, and I was able to use this for brazing. So you will need a pair of brazing or torch type goggles or glasses. That's very important. Over time, it's really going to hurt your eyes, and it could do damage ultimately if you continue to do it without some sort of protection. Overall, it's great to have eye protect, or I shouldn't say great. It's imperative that you guys use eye protection in scenarios like this. You just never know what's going to pop. You never know what's going to, you know, fly out. So I've had a few things fly out, and we'll get to that in a second when we start talking about magnets. Some of the other things that are important to have, you're going to need a wire brush of sorts. Wire brushes are important when you start cleaning the areas that you're going to be doing your brazing. Similar to welding, you want to clean those areas, prep the areas before you actually start doing the brazing. You want to alleviate as much contaminants in the welding, brazing area as much as possible. One of the things that I kind of decided over time with experience, I don't really need gloves to do brazing. Yes, this gets incredibly hot, but for the most part, I'm not touching the material that I'm actually brazing. I'm holding a torch, my hand's pretty far away from the heat, and what I'm brazing or what I'm torching, I'm not touching with my other hand. I'm holding the filler wire, and that wire doesn't get that hot, except at the tip. So when you're starting out, it's probably a good idea to wear protective gloves, leather gloves. Welding gloves are fine too. That's probably a bit overkill for what we're doing here. But as you get better and better at it, you'll realize that The heat, there really is very little heat transfer or radiant heat from brazing. So I keep the gloves nearby, but I don't use them very often. But again, as you're starting out, it's important that you probably give it a whirl with the gloves before you start doing it with bare hands. Everything else that's here is really kind of just stuff that I've added over time that have helped me when I was doing my cage build. Magnets, as I mentioned before, were really lifesavers when it comes to put these over here. These I think I got off of McMaster-Carr as well. I'm sure you can get them at other places. They are incredibly useful for keeping the rods in place, the rods parallel with other rods as you're welding or brazing them together. They do really well with other pieces of steel if you're trying to get, I think you guys can see this overhead, if you're trying to get something to stand vertically. They sell magnets that have 90-degree angles. I found that these magnets do a little bit better because the ones with the 90-degree angles have plastic on them and will melt over time. What's very important to realize though is that magnets don't do well with heat. If you're brazing something or welding something very close to a magnet will explode. It just pops. So try to keep the heat away from the magnets. So the reason I'm showing you these plates is I've used these plates over time to align things. If you get enough magnets kind of stacked together, a lot of times the steel will get magnetized. You guys can see that probably, where that rod basically just aligns itself with the steel plate. So I've used a lot of these steel plates as base plates, as ways to kind of keep the rods in place. Again, you can kind of see that the magnets magnetize the steel will hold the rod in place, and you can hold two rods together that way. What else can I share with you guys? So we got the, obviously very, kind of dirty and sooty after a while. So we got the igniter, we've got the brush, we've got steel plates, we've got magnets, we've got the rods, we've got the torch, the gloves. A pair of pliers is always very handy to pick up things. When these things get red hot, obviously you don't want to be touching them. And a pair of pliers is always very handy to have on hand. And lastly, I think one of these little guys are useful. I didn't use it that much. I think you guys can see this in the overhead. These are very common for hobbyists when they're doing soldering or very kind of intricate. I know a lot of fly fishermen use these to kind of tie their flies. I've used these to help hold two pieces of rod together at a very specific or difficult angle, and it works out pretty well. It doesn't work in every scenario, but it's definitely helpful to have on hand. So that kind of covers all of the tools and materials that you need. If I went a little bit too fast, I apologize. I'm trying to keep the video kind of short. I know my videos run long. If you have any questions, again, post in the comments below. I'll be happy to help you guys out. So I'm going to clean up this mess. I'm going to get organized. I'll come back and I'll show you the process in which I actually braze these items together. And we're back. So I've got everything kind of set up here. We're going to do a little bit of brazing. Hopefully this looks good on film. I haven't tested this before, so you guys bear with me. One thing I forgot to mention is ventilation. Now, this particular rod claims it's low fumes. I don't know what that means exactly. I happen to be doing this in a basement. This is my home. I have a family. Obviously, I'm trying to make sure that my family is safe. And I would hope that everybody who's watching this that may attempt any of what I'm about to do, they're going to take precautions. I have a fire extinguisher there. And this big thing that you guys see in the background, hopefully you guys can see this. This is my exhaust system. Now I rigged this up. It's got an inline fan. It pumps right out to the outside. By the way, I'll link all of these things in the descriptions below. You know, the rod, the Flux, the exhaust fan, whatever it is, if you guys are having a hard time finding the particular item that you see here that I'm using, just leave a question in the comments below. I'll be happy to provide a link for you where I got it. A lot of what I got was purchased at McMaster Car, so you can use that kind of as a, you know, a launching point. So anyway, so let's jump into this process. This is the fun stuff. I've got one single rod. I'm probably going to use probably 1 inch of it total. One of the tricks of the trade that I learned, and I'm sure maybe some of you guys know this, always bend one end to a 90-degree angle. Sorry, I don't know if you guys can see that. And the reason for that, I'll show you guys over in the camera over here. That's probably not going to focus. But the reason for that is that you always know that this is the cold end. This is the end that you're going to hold on to. This is the end that if you are going to pick this up off the table, you always pick it up from this end. This is the end that you aren't torching. That way you never accidentally pick up a hot end. I've done it. I've gotten close to picking it up towards the end where it was hot enough that I dropped it. I didn't burn myself. But if you bend the end, it's at least helpful to know that this is the cold end, this is the hot end. So that's why I did that. One of the other things that you're going to do before you do anything else, you got to pull these rods out. Hopefully you guys can see this from the camera above. Let's see, I got these in here so nicely I can't even get them out now. Hold on. Jeez. All right. So that goes there, that goes there. You need to clean up your workspace or your brazing space. Scrub this down, make sure all the dirt and debris, anything else is off of there. Get the corrosion off. Hopefully you guys can hear me okay. You guys hear me okay? All right, anyway. Shine that up real good. Get all that corrosion off. Eventually I'm gonna media blast this guy, so I'm not too concerned how it looks right now, but it's important to get this area kind of cleaned and scuffed up. I'm assuming you guys can see what I'm doing on the overhead here. All right. These guys are pretty clean. They're fresh material, so they don't have a lot of corrosion or rust. Let's see, try to remember how these go back in. Like so. Oh, before we move forward, so this is where the Flux comes in. Man, I don't know which camera to talk to. This is what it looks like. Let's zoom in here. It's basically a chalky paste. You guys can see that. It's a little bit. And, you know, honestly, I don't know if you're supposed to, but when it dries up, I just add a few drops of water, kind of mix it up, get it going again. That's probably absolutely wrong thing to do, but that's what I do. There's a lot of different ways to apply the Flux. You can use a brush, you can use like a little flathead screwdriver. What works really well for me, I basically just kind of dip it in the Flux, try to get enough on there around the outside, just coat it that you have enough on there that gets a little chalky. Let's see if we can go over here. You guys can kind of see it. Let's see. Focus, focus. No, no focus. Really? No focus? There we go. Nope. Nope. There, focus. Now you guys can see it. All right, so I like to get about that much on there. You guys get an idea just kind of how what it looks like. I get a little bit inside, a little bit on the outside. Stick this guy on there. Boom. Just like that. In this particular case, I've got to do both of them at the same time. It's kind of problematic to try to do one and then stick the other one in. So I'm going to shove both of them in there and braze them up at the same time, especially since the two come together at the intersection over towards the front. So get a bunch on there. It's a little hard to see what the fish mouth looks like, which way it's supposed to go, but let's see. Getting it off wasn't easy, so getting it back on is not going to be easy either. There we go. So what you can do, like I said, if you want, you can use a little flathead. Well, I should have cleaned the flathead screwdriver first. Always clean the flathead screwdriver first. You can dab a little bit more flux on here to make sure that it gets on the rest of the cage, because you really want the filler wire to flow really nicely over the existing cage, as well as the new pieces on the cage. Clean magnets are always good. So if you get into the point where your magnets are dirty, just get a towel and kind of rub them clean. Magnets are great. So magnets have nice flat spots. These two rods are fixed in place. Hopefully you guys can see that from overhead. This is the rod that's not fixed in place. So if I slide this guy over, it's going to attract this new rod and align it with these other two rods, which I think is very helpful. I like to do that on both rods before I start brazing that center piece together. We're going to start over here. Once this is brazed together, is this centered? Once this is brazed, this center piece is brazed together, we can pull the magnets off and then do the other pieces over here, and they should be pretty well in place. So let's make sure that this guy is centered. Hopefully you guys can see that. Looks pretty good. So now we've got the two new pieces in place. They align with the center there. I'm just eyeballing it. I'm sure that there's, you know, an argument to be made to actually, you know, align it with like a right angle or a straight edge of some sort. But at this point, the cage is held up perfectly fine without it. I'm just adding it because I know that I kind of skimped out when I was originally doing it. So at this point, I'm going to clear off the workbench, get everything kind of away from the flame. Close that up. We've got my rod. We'll lay the rod here so that it's easily accessible. Same with the torch. All right, let's get to it. So flip my hat around here. I'm going to throw on my helmet. Again, the helmet is not required. A pair of torch glasses or goggles is all you need for this. I just have a helmet. It works really well because when I flip it down, I can still see through it, but it's protecting my face and my eyes from the torch. So let's get to it. So with the torch, you're always going to turn your fuel on first. You're going to get your fuel to burn, and then you're going to slowly introduce the oxygen to get the flame where you want it to be. I'm going to have a hard time talking while I've got my helmet down. You guys aren't going to be able to hear me. But the overall idea here is that you move the torch around to get all of the areas hot. You need to get your new material hot, and you need to get the existing material, in this case, this cross member, hot enough that when the new bronze filler rod is introduced, it grabs everything and brings them together. So the flux is going to help kind of spread it out. And you guys will be able to see when I do this what sort of happens to the material. It sort of just turns into a liquid and finds all of the crevices and fills in those areas. So we got our sparker. We're going to turn on the fuel. Actually, before I do that, sorry, I'm going to have to like come across here. We're going to need to plug in my exhaust fan, which I didn't do earlier. So you're going to have a little bit of extra noise. Apologize for that. Sorry, probably a little bit too close to the camera. So I've got my exhaust coming out here. Whenever I light my torch, you get a lot of black silt that comes out of the acetylene. I try to point it at the exhaust vent, suck it up out of there. Again, my understanding is that this stuff is not toxic, but I don't want to be polluting my house with it. So hopefully you guys can see all of this in the cameras, at least in the one below or above. So I'm going to turn on my fuel just a little bit. See all that black soot? I like to exhaust that out. So at this point is when I start to introduce oxygen. And sometimes you get a little blowout. So actually, you guys probably, hopefully you guys can see this in one of these cameras. I didn't really let the oxygen cycle through, which is something that's very helpful when you're doing this. There we go. So hopefully you guys can see what that looks like, at least in the camera above. Can you see that over here? Trying to keep this away from all my RC car parts. So, all right, I'm gonna flip the hood down. I really should have this down. At this point, you don't want to be looking at this flame. It's pretty bright. It looks like it's okay on camera, but generally speaking, you don't want to be staring at this flame for very long. So after you turn on the fuel, before you turn on the oxygen, flip your mask down or put your glasses on to make sure that you're not hurting your eyes. So I'm going to flip this down. Again, I'm not going to be able to talk to you guys. I'm going to try, but hopefully, I apologize if the sound is a little muffled. Got my filler rod here with the bent end towards the back. I'm going to go down. So again, you need to move the torch around, and when the white powdery stuff starts to liquefy, you know that you're starting to get to the point where you can melt the rod. And that's what a braze joint looks like. So that took a little bit longer than normal. I think probably because I didn't have enough fuel added in. But normally it doesn't take quite that long to heat up the surrounding areas. If you have a nice hot torch going here, something more like that probably is appropriate. You guys can actually hear that, I'm sure. That's going to heat up much faster with that amount of oxygen. And like I said, I probably should be doing this with my helmet down, but trying to give you guys some play-by-play here. So that joint is done. It's holding this rod in place. I can come back now and do these without the magnet. Again, you really don't want the magnet in play in the area that you're brazing. It'll pop if it gets too hot. So Nice joint. One more to go, and you can see the heat is actually traveling across, and the flux over here is actually starting to bubble. That's how hot the whole cage is getting hot now. Always turn your oxygen off first, but if you can, make sure you're pointing the fuel that's burning with all that black soot to your exhaust so that at least it exhausts out. Turned off. Again, remember, this is the hot end. Put it away from you. Make sure you're not touching anything, burning anything. And the cage is incredibly hot. Do not touch it. Obviously, the heat hasn't transferred all the way to the ends, but anywhere in this area you can feel the heat radiating. Don't touch it. Give you guys kind of a closer look of what those joints look like. They're not pretty. They will be pretty once we bead blast them, media blast them, and that's the next steps. Is brazing the right option? I don't know. It's something it's affordable. It's something that's much easier for the kind of regular guy like me to do. I don't have my house set up to do any sort of MIG or TIG welding. I know TIG welding would be the ideal solution here. MIG welding might be a little bit messy, but overall, brazing is a great solution, and you can do so much with brazing beyond these cages. So for me, it was the right solution and the ideal solution, since I had already had experience with it anyways. But for you guys starting out, give it a whirl. The tank setups, the smaller tank setups that you get from Home Depot are pretty inexpensive, and you might have to go through a couple different tanks in order to do an entire cage, but you know, I think it's worth the effort, and it's substantially cheaper than it would be to buy any sort of MIG or TIG setup. So take that for what it is. In this particular case, I'm not going to wire brush it. I'm going to end up media blasting the entire cage to get it cleaned up and ready for paint. So I'm not going to worry too much about this. I still have some more pieces to do on the front bumper, and ultimately it's really not too much of a concern at this point. All right, guys, I hope that kind of covered it. And, you know, I know that there's a lot of information there. I know I tend to get long-winded. I know these videos are long. Thanks for sticking with me. If you have any questions, make sure, again, you leave it in the comment section below. I'm usually really good about getting back to you guys within a day or so. And like I said before, I can't emphasize this enough. You guys have got to be extra careful when you're working with these oxyacetylene torches, propane oxygen torch setups. You know, there's so many opportunities for things to go bad. I'd hate to hear that, you know, something went wrong after somebody watched one of my videos. Make sure you have, you know, a fire extinguisher next to you. Make sure you have access to water. Just make sure you're safe. Use your judgment. Don't do anything half-ass here. You know, we're talking about, you know, life and death stuff. I know it's a little dramatic, but, you know, hey, you know, I just got to say it because, you know, I take every precaution that I can to make sure that I'm safe, my family's safe, my home is safe. So I want you guys to do the same. But, you know, it's fun. This is it's a hobby. Let's have fun with it. Let's not get too bogged down with all of that. But keep that in mind, all right? Again, if you guys have any questions, leave in the comment section below. Give me that thumbs up. Subscribe if you guys haven't already. That part 3 and part 4 video will come out eventually, and we'll keep this going. All right, guys, take care, and until the next video.